Imagine living a normal, everyday life where you go to work, you spend time with your family, you do all the things that we all do, and then one day you just disappear without a trace. And then years later, you're found alive, but living as a completely different person with no memory of your former life. Now, it sounds like the plot of a Hollywood thriller, but for Lawrence Joseph Bader, this bizarre and confounding twist was his real life. Welcome back to Scary Tales, where we dive into the darkest, most mysterious real life stories. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe, and if you like today's story, offer to take the like button on a sailing trip, and then throw it overboard and see if it ever comes back to shore. And if it does, refer to it as the subscribe button and see if it knows the difference. Today's story isn't just strange, it's downright puzzling. It's a tale about a man who vanished only to be found living a second life that no one could have imagined. This is the story of Lawrence Joseph Bader. Now, the date was May 15th, 1957. And Lawrence Bader, known as Larry to his friends and family, was living a rather ordinary life in Akron, Ohio. He was a cookware salesman for a local company, earning a modest living to support his wife Marilou and their 3 children. The Bader family was awaiting the arrival of a 4th child, adding more pressure to Larry's already strained financial situation. But despite the normalcy, Larry had ambitions that went beyond his career as a salesman. Friends described him as someone who longed for adventure and excitement, though he never expressed any overt desire to escape his responsibilities. But on that particular day, in May, Larry told his wife he was heading to Cleveland on a business trip. So he packed his bags, kissed Marilou goodbye, and he left the house. And at this point, no one suspected that it would be the last time the Bader family would see the man that they knew as Lawrence Joseph Bader. Larry drove to Cleveland as planned, but once he arrived, something strange happened. Instead of conducting business, Larry went to a local boat rental company along the shores of Lake Erie. He rented a 14-foot boat and paid for it using a check. The boat rental operator warned of an impending storm, but Larry, seemingly unbothered, decided to take the boat out on the lake anyway. He had a small supply of fishing equipment with him, and by all appearances, it seemed that Larry was planning to spend the afternoon on the water. Now, the weather forecast proved accurate, and the waters of Lake Erie became tumultuous. Strong winds and heavy rain made conditions extremely dangerous, and when Larry didn't return, a search was initiated. Authorities found the boat the next day, abandoned on the lake, badly damaged but still afloat, but there was no sign of Larry. His body wasn't recovered, and it was assumed that he had been thrown overboard and drowned in the storm. The official conclusion was that Lawrence Bader was dead. But what happened next made this story far more complicated, because while Lawrence Bader's family was grieving his presumed death, 400 miles away in Omaha, Nebraska, a man named John Fritz Johnson emerged. Now, Fritz was larger than life. He was a charismatic local celebrity known for his outgoing personality and memorable mustache. He worked as a bartender, sportscaster, and radio announcer, and had a distinct flair for entertainment. Fritz appeared in Omaha in around 1957, not long after Bader's supposed death. He was well-liked, quickly gaining a reputation as a fun-loving bachelor with a deep sense of adventure. He was known for his catchphrase, "It's Fritz with the Sports Blitz." He became a beloved figure in the community, working as a radio DJ and even landing a spot as a sportscaster on a local television station. But to anyone in Omaha, Fritz was just a regular guy with a passion for life and for sports. He lived his life to the fullest, enjoying his time at the country club, socializing with friends, and diving into new adventures. He was an archer, an avid outdoorsman, and a man who seemed to live without any worries. However, something was off about Fritz Johnson, because despite being a well-known figure, no one knew much about him. He was careful to never talk in detail about where he came from or what he did before he arrived in Omaha. His personal history was always vague, and when asked, he simply stated that he had spent time in the military and had done odd jobs here and there. His easygoing nature, charm, and infectious personality meant that most people didn't press him for details. Fritz was simply Fritz, a local icon with a larger-than-life presence. And as years went by, and no one in Omaha ever suspected that this outgoing man with a well-crafted public persona might be anyone other than who he claimed to be. But back in Akron, Ohio, the Bader family was still trying to move forward from Larry's disappearance. Marilou, left to raise 4 children on her own, eventually accepted the reality that her husband was in fact dead. She received his life insurance payout, remarried, and continued her life as best she could. But even though Lawrence Bader was presumed dead, fate had a way of bringing the strange mystery to the surface once again. Now, it wasn't until 1965, which is 8 years after Larry's disappearance, that the two worlds of Lawrence Joseph Bader and John Fritz Johnson would collide in a way that no one could have ever predicted. The chain of events that led to this discovery began with a simple archery competition in Chicago. Fritz Johnson was an excellent archer, and he often competed in regional competitions. And at one of these events, Fritz was photographed by a magazine photographer who happened to be from Akron, Ohio, the very city where Larry Bader had once lived. Now, the photographer couldn't shake the eerie feeling that Fritz looked exactly like the missing Lawrence Bader. So he contacted some of Bader's relatives back in Akron, and they were equally stunned by the resemblance. But soon after, one of Bader's nephews traveled to Omaha to meet Fritz Johnson in person. Now, when the nephew confronted Fritz about his identity, Fritz just kind of laughed it off. He denied being Lawrence Joseph Bader and maintained that he had no idea who that was. But the nephew was convinced, and he just was adamant, and the family pressed the issue, and it set off a series of investigations that would shake both the Bader family and Fritz's new life in Omaha, Nebraska. Now, after the Bader family's claims gained traction, authorities in both Ohio and Nebraska became involved. They needed proof to determine whether Fritz Johnson was indeed the long-lost Lawrence Bader. And the most direct way to establish this was through fingerprint analysis. It was the best they had at the time. And as it turned out, Lawrence Joseph Bader had a military record, and his fingerprints were on file. Fritz Johnson, being a public figure, had also been fingerprinted when applying for a bartending license in Omaha. And when authorities compared the two sets of fingerprints, the results were shocking. Or were they? They were a match. There was no doubt about it. Fritz Johnson and Lawrence Joseph Bader were the same person. This discovery sent shockwaves through both communities. For the people in Akron, Lawrence Bader's reappearance, alive and well after being presumed dead, was a stunning revelation. And for the people of Omaha, the news that their beloved Fritz Johnson was living a double life was equally hard to believe. But the most surprising twist came from Fritz himself, because even after the fingerprints confirmed his identity, he continued to deny being Lawrence Bader. And he was adamant about this. He claimed to have no memory of his life before arriving in Omaha, and according to him, he'd never heard of Lawrence Bader, had no recollection of a wife or children in Ohio, and had no knowledge of any other life. It was as if the two lives had never intersected in his mind at all, period. And he was 100% adamant about this. So what happened? How did Lawrence Bader transform into John Fritz? Seemingly without any memory of his former life? Well, several theories emerged over the years, but none have really definitively explained the mystery. There is one theory that says that Bader could have potentially suffered from amnesia, possibly due to a head trauma or another psychological event. The stress of his financial struggles combined with his desire for a more adventurous life may have somehow contributed to a psychological break. Or perhaps after the storm on Lake Erie, Bader, washed ashore, disoriented, suffering from memory loss from a potential knock on the noggin. In this state, he may have assumed a new identity, gradually, or, maybe creating the persona of John Fritz subconsciously. And another possibility is that Bader deliberately faked his own death. Some investigators believe that Bader was just kind of tired of his responsibilities at home, and he was just eager for a fresh start. And he just kind of used the storm as an opportunity to disappear and to start a new life. And this theory is supported by the fact that Bader had been deeply in debt at the time of his disappearance. And he'd actually even received a letter from the IRS demanding payment for overdue taxes just days before he vanished. And by faking his own death, Bader could have maybe escaped his financial problems and lived the carefree, adventurous life he'd always dreamed of. But if Bader did fake his own death, why would he deny being Lawrence Bader even after the truth was uncovered, even after the fingerprints? Was it possible that he'd convinced himself so thoroughly that he was Fritz Johnson that he no longer remembered his former identity? Or was it simply part of his plan to maintain the illusion of his new life? Yet another theory suggests that Bader may have been potentially suffering from dissociative identity disorder. This was previously known as multiple personality disorder, and in this case, Bader could have created an entirely separate identity. This Fritz Johnson could have been a means of escaping the emotional stress and pressure of his old life. Dissociative identity disorder is characterized by the presence of two or more distinct identities or personalities, each with its own patterns of perceiving and interacting with the world. And if Bader had developed such a condition, it's possible that this Fritz Johnson was a completely separate identity that Bader just kind of assumed unconsciously. However, there's very little hard evidence to support the dissociative identity disorder theory, and it remains largely speculative, but still it would explain how Bader could live as two completely different people and be so convinced and have neither of them be aware of each other. Could the stress of being a husband and a father, combined with the responsibilities of his financial situation, could have caused this Lawrence Bader to maybe compartmentalize his life so deeply that he became someone else? No one can really say for certain, but regardless of which theory is true, whether Bader faked his death, suffered amnesia, or experienced a dissociative break, the fact remains that Lawrence Bader did live as John Fritz for nearly a decade, seemingly without any knowledge or recollection of his former life. And he seemed to do this seamlessly, like he'd been this person his whole life. And the discovery of Fritz Johnson's true identity created an incredibly complicated situation for everyone involved, because the Bader family in Akron was especially affected. For Marilu Bader, who had remarried and moved on with her life, the revelation that her husband had been alive all this time was shocking. She grieved him. She believed Lawrence was dead for 8 years and had gone through the entire grieving process. She'd received life insurance benefits and remarried in good faith, thinking her first husband was gone forever. But Lawrence Bader's reappearance presented a host of legal and emotional complications. Was she still married to Lawrence? Or was her new marriage valid? The legal system was equally confused. And since Bader had been declared legally dead, how should his reappearance be handled? This had never really happened before. There'd been no documented cases of this really widespread. And for his children, the discovery of their father's double life was no less shocking. They'd grown up believing their father died in a tragic accident, only to find out that he'd been alive, living as a different person just a few states away. How are they supposed to reconcile the image of their father with this outgoing, charismatic Fritz Johnson? They weren't even close to being the same people. And meanwhile, in Omaha, the local community was just as stunned. Fritz Johnson was a well-known figure in the city. He was beloved for his personality and sports broadcasting work. And the fact that he'd been living a double life, and might not even have known it, was a source of not only fascination, but for some, disbelief. Legally, Fritz Johnson faced numerous challenges. There were questions about the life insurance money Marilu had received. Could the insurance company demand that money back? Now that Bader was revealed to be alive, what happens with that? Additionally, there were tax issues stemming from the time that Bader disappeared. Those were also washed away, and questions about whether any laws had been broken if he had indeed faked his death. Yet, despite the chaos, Fritz Johnson himself remained adamant that he had no memory of his life as Lawrence Bader. He continued to insist that he was simply Fritz, and had always been Fritz. And to him, the notion that he was ever Lawrence Bader was nothing more than a bizarre and impossible story. He literally felt like people were playing a trick on him. Fritz's life, once filled with energy and excitement, was irrevocably changed by the discovery of his past. Though he continued to work as a sports broadcaster and maintained some of his public persona, this shadow of Lawrence Bader now loomed over every single thing that he did. The medical community, intrigued by his case, examined him in hopes of finding some medical explanation for his situation. And neurologists and psychologists grabbed Mr. Bader and conducted these tests to determine whether his memory loss was genuine. Ultimately, the results were inconclusive. There was no clear physical or psychological explanation for why Fritz Johnson could have forgotten his life as Lawrence Bader. But the possibility of amnesia or some form of dissociative condition did remain plausible. There was one particular detail of the case that intrigued investigators, and that was that Fritz Johnson had a distinctive eye condition, a cataract that required surgical correction. And interestingly enough, Lawrence Bader had the same eye condition before his disappearance. And both men had undergone the same treatment. This added further proof to the fact that Fritz was indeed Bader, though at this point no one questioned it. There was nothing to explain the mystery of how he could have forgotten his old life so completely, but there was no denying this was the same person. And despite his insistence that he was Fritz and not Lawrence, the revelation of his true identity took a toll on Fritz Johnson's health. He became withdrawn and less active in the community, and the stress of being caught between these two lives, compounded by the ongoing questions from his family and the public, seemed to wear him down. And what had started as an exciting and carefree life in Omaha now seemed overshadowed by the weight of his past. Tragically, Fritz Johnson's life would be cut short, and in 1966, less than a year after his true identity was revealed, Fritz was diagnosed with terminal liver cancer, and he died at the age of 39, taking with him many of the secrets surrounding his double life. And to the very end, Fritz maintained that he had no memory of being Lawrence Bader. He was ultimately laid to rest in Omaha, not as Lawrence Joseph Bader, but as John Fritz Johnson, the identity that he had lived under for nearly a decade. Now, even after Fritz Johnson's death, the mystery of Lawrence Joseph Bader's disappearance and reappearance continues to captivate people. And to this day, his case remains one of the most puzzling examples of dual identity and possible amnesia in modern history. Over the years, numerous articles, documentaries, and books have explored the story, but there's never been a definitive answer that's ever been found. Psychologists, criminologists, and historians have all tried to piece together the mystery, but the exact circumstances surrounding Lawrence Bader's transformation into Fritz Johnson remain unknown to this day. Did he genuinely lose his memory? Or was he simply running away from a life he no longer wanted? The answer may never be known. But Bader's story has become a fascinating case study in identity, memory, and the human mind's capacity for reinvention. Whether by accident or by choice, Bader's ability to create an entirely new life and live it convincingly for nearly a decade raises questions about how much of our identities are tied to the lives that we lead and how easily those lives can be changed. And for the Bader family, the revelations about Lawrence brought closure, but also deep emotional wounds. Mary Lou and the children had to reconcile the image of a loving father and husband with the reality that he had lived a secret life. Though they never fully understood why Lawrence left them, they were eventually able to move on with their lives after his death. Family chose to remember him as the man he was before he disappeared, rather than dwell on the confusion and the heartbreak that his double life had caused. As for the people of Omaha, Fritz Johnson remains a local legend, a man who lived with gusto and left an indelible mark on the city. And even today, some old-timers remember the charismatic sportscaster who became a local icon. But behind his jovial smile and the catchphrase was a man with a mysterious past, one that will forever leave people wondering about the truth behind his story. So what do you guys think? Was it a case of amnesia? Maybe a psychological break? Or do you think it was a deliberate attempt to leave his old life behind? You know, the truth might never really be fully understood, but one thing is clear. Lawrence Bader, or Fritz Johnson, however you want to say it, lived one of the most unusual and baffling double lives ever recorded. You know, if you enjoyed today's story, I want you to make sure that you toss that like button overboard, and hopefully it won't disappear for 8 years. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, guys. That way you'll never miss another mind-bending tale like this one. We upload once or twice a week. So stay tuned for more real-life mysteries and bizarre stories that'll leave you questioning everything that you think you knew. Oh, and Poe? Wait, where is Poe again? Right. He's still not animated yet. You definitely are going to have to fix that again. But thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Remember, stay curious, stay brave, and remember, sometimes the craziest stories are the ones that are all too real.